Good morning. Slay the Spire 2 recently came out in early access, and I've been enjoying it way more than I expected to. I was going into it truthfully expecting to dislike it, having been enjoying Slay the Spire 1 a lot less in the last year or so. I ended up really enjoying it thus far, and honestly, I can't wait to play more. I wanted to put out a video on some quick early thoughts I've had on the game. Some will be suggestions for things I'd like to see changed or improved on, some will just be some positive reaction to elements. The video will be a bit looser than normal, but that's okay. Thought number 1, run structure changes. For Slay the Spire 1 fans, I think something that's been really interesting and engaging are some of the reimaginings of the core structure of a run, particularly the post-boss relics. I'm really happy with the changes here. Boss relics definitely held a soft spot in my heart for the consistency of 4 mana in Act 2, or at least by Act 3, being such a defining part of the standard Slay the Spire run to me, but I'm glad the expectation is largely that you will only have 3 mana, sometimes 4 mana of course, but with some other thematically excellent benefit instead. Going forward, I hope this relationship with mana stays. The new ancient relics are pretty engaging, and I've been having a good time with them. That's what I was originally planning on saying. However, I've started watching Jorbs recently. My Slay the Spire 1 learnings were nearly entirely self-taught, besides the very start where I only bought the game because watching Northern Lion was so frustrating, so I had a little bit of knowledge on how NL approached the game. Anyway, in this Jorbs video, among other things, he talks about boss relics, and he suggests loosely that the 4 energy-seeking cultural standard is, while not outdated per se, is something really worth challenging. Jorbs mentions that a lot of players' opinions about certain cards and relics and macro-level decision-making was ingrained during the first couple of years playing the game, before recent updates and balances, and mentions that this is perhaps one such assumption. I definitely fell into this. I've been playing since before the defect, and frankly, I still operate with logic I was using well before certain relics and cards were even added. This has meant that I'm used to playing Slay the Spire 1 in such a way, where I basically plan to take whatever energy relic appears, because ultimately, I was and still am very rarely punished for planning to do that. But Jorbs talks a lot about opening yourself up on Act 1 to put yourself in a situation where you can justify Snecko Eye or Runic Pyramid. At least for the Ironclad video, I haven't watched the other characters' videos yet, but this makes perfect sense. Hell, it aligns with something I talk about in some thoughts on Slay the Spire 1, where you want to open yourself up to as many options for theoretical strength increasing as opposed to limiting them, and emphasizing that value for critical power points, such as getting your boss relics, is a really good add-on to that. The other part of this that Jorbs mentions is that it's really easy to imagine how to make your build better if you take an energy relic, and the easiest builds to pilot in Act 1 and play around with and extend into winning will make use of that energy relic. But playing for win cons that work well with non-energy relics and permitting your Act 1 choices to let you take those options is rather beneficial. I hope I haven't mischaracterized Jorbs' opinions here, but this is personally one of the many things I got out of my recent Jorbs kick. So how does this come back to Slay the Spire 2? For starters, I think people that have a similar history to me and possibly share my understanding that we're typically to think about 4 energy as reliable, desirable, and mostly strategize with assuming that it will be the way we want to play. I think the new system for post-boss power being these ancient relics which aren't as energy focused will be really engaging. And I do think the choices being more variable than Spire ones will create more interesting inflection points in decision-making overall. However, I brought all that up to say, while I found this to be something really engaging about my experiences so far with Slay the Spire 2, ultimately, maybe 20% of the excitement was weirdly my own fault, because I constructed a situation I wasn't aware I was constructing about how to plan for a run, where I mostly put myself in would only like an energy relic from Act 1 boss situations, when I could have been more fluid in my playstyles when considering planning for other theoretical boss relics. This may seem like a roundabout thought, and may not have been a great one to have started the video on, but roundabout thoughts are great. They're much safer for everyone than traffic light thoughts. But also, I think one humorous thing about getting into Slay the Spire 2 after playing a fair bit of Slay 1 is that sometimes your changes in playstyle are just because you're approaching something as if it is new, even if parts are the same. Back to run structure changes, I love the event changes too. Slay the Spire 1's events were good for sure, but I feel like Slay the Spire 2's are a cut above. Not just aesthetically, I think the design of them feels super clean and satisfying. I love the event that forces you to exchange a relic. I mean, obviously I hate it, half the time the options are worse, but I think this is exactly the kind of event I want in a game like this. The Egg Quest event? Lovely. I think the quest events in Slay 1 ended up feeling a little flat in the end, but I love the ones I've seen so far in Slay 2. I think events kind of go in the background a lot in Slay 1, so this glow up has felt really prominent to me. Could be a newness thing though, like Vampires and the Intangible event were both rather game warping, and I haven't seen a true equivalent for that yet, other than the ancient relics, but I wouldn't be surprised if it exists, or will exist. Jorbs, in one of his daily wrap-up chats, mentioned that the Act 1s in Slay the Spire were starkly harder than Slay the Spire 1's Act 1. I don't know whether that's true or not, but personally I've enjoyed the power level it plays at for now. It's been good. Thought number 2, visual overhaul. The visuals look much better than I expected them to, and the game feels so much more vibrant and satisfying than I expected it to be. The early screenshots and images of the game, for some reason, made me think like it was almost a bit of a downgrade from Slay the Spire 1, and with some models, I still prefer the old ones, mostly just due to my extended history and love for the game more than some overall better design. But seeing the game in full, with the animations and visual flair and polish, has really sold me on it. This is partly also because I really appreciate and respect how different the Spire itself is. I don't know exactly why I assume this, but I was very much expecting to see all of the same enemies, the same flaws, and things to basically be like an add-on to the content in Slay the Spire 1, just with some additional reimaginings. Like, that's kind of what games like Risk of Rain did, right? Like, a large amount of enemies were returned. The Stone Titan, Lemurian, Wisps, Worms, they both have Sky Meadow, a lot of the items are the same. This isn't a bad thing per se, but my expectations were that Slay the Spire would do something similar. Instead, there's like a few enemies transferred over, and certainly a lot of references or characters who are related to Slay the Spire 1 characters, but ultimately you aren't fighting, say, the Champ, or the Hexaghost, or Chosen, or other really iconic and impactful Slay the Spire 1 enemies. This has meant that all these new characters and flaws don't have some sort of old aesthetic I'm comparing them to, so I just get to sit excitedly seeing these new guys being beautiful and cool. I'm now really positive on the visual design of this game. I also initially had the opinion when seeing trailers that the UI changes were a little mid, but I've come to like it very quickly. I still think things feel a little too busy and big. I've heard this was partly because of porting to other consoles, especially mobile, but that's acceptable. I also want to mention that I love the way the new cards look. One of my favorite things in card games is the aesthetic and fantasy of your hand. I'm not going to go over that too much here, but this is a pretty important factor to me, and I love the vibrancy of the colors of the new cards. It feels really satisfying. The full art cards is something that I think was a bold choice, since Slay the Spire 1 was pretty conservative with cards looking different, but tying them to something genuinely alternative like the Ancients cards has felt pretty deserving and pretty good overall. And I'll include this here in the visual design section. The map changes, particularly the color-coded nodes, and the fact that you can draw are fantastic adds that used to be mods. Great little additions. It'll be a surprise in future returning to Slay the Spire 1 and not being able to draw on the map. Thought number 3, Epochs. I am such a fan of this Epoch system, really enjoying the way the lore and storytelling is being told through the system. It feels so Slay the Spire to have just a short story, a beautiful image, and then some unlocks. There's such a beautiful Slay the Spire charm to that, and seeing this system got me so excited to play the game more. Beautiful system, hope it stays much like it is. Although I do wish at some point, and maybe this happens, there'll be a way to view all the epochs in line order. Like currently, the idea is that there are certain stories being told in order, and that some of the stories are temporally parallel, but on this line, they're a little bit all over the place. I'd love if there was a button to like straighten all the lines into categories where epochs fit together into their line, so you can follow them easier. Very minor thing, but I think it'd be neat. Thought number 4, new characters. There are 2 new characters in Slay the Spire 2, and they're both alright. I'm not overly enamored by them, but I think they're as close to what I would want from any new characters. As a personal opinion, I think new characters are probably the thing I'd have wanted the least from new Slay the Spire stuff. That's a personal thing. I think I'm wowed enough by Ironclad and Silent that anything that uses a floating resource, like orbs, stances, stars, or a skeleton hand named Osti, doesn't appeal to me much, but that's me personally. The Regent is the most likely to suffer from the consequences of having access to a build that requires going all in on a new resource and getting some benefit out of it. Like, sometimes the Regent will feel like you don't want to bother with stars, so your card rewards are limited. Or if you're going to stars a little, you might as well go all the way if offered, ignoring anything else. That's a hyperbole that, as you play more and more, will dwindle in salience, and the beauty of the interplay between archetypes within the variants will blossom for some really interesting gameplay, and is not some sort of inherent fundamental issue. But even as you start to internalize the card pool and start getting these archetypes meshing with each other in some sort of interesting way, I still think the Regent will feel clunky sometimes. But that's okay. Something feeling a little clunkier isn't a bad thing, it is just a thing. I imagine the Regent is meant to feel slightly clunky, in the same way that Bludgeon or Meteor Strike can feel clunky. When you're messing around with big numbers achieved through weird circumstances and deck building restrictions, that'll happen. Also, shout out to Shaw Gamble. The very first thing I learned about Slay the Spire 2 post-release was that there's a Netrunner reference. Netrunner people, I need this to be an alt art that I can run in my runner decks. Necrobinder aesthetically is sick as hell. I've enjoyed her style, and she's probably going to slot in as my second favorite character behind the Ironclad, I expect. I love that her draw is mostly, although not entirely, with this Souls package. That feels very satisfying to me and will be exciting to think about and plan about when you start going into the Ascensions and needing to be critical in your choices. The awkward dissonance of you'll want some draw to get to key cards and to softly weed out bad cards, but also shuffling too many souls will mean that all your souls are doing is drawing souls when the cards that generated those souls could have simply been better cards, is a really interesting theoretical question that'll be really enjoyable to start developing logic and strategy around. The new characters are, in general, cool, and they have that classic Slay the Spire charm to them. The regent maybe feels slightly out of place to me by having such a personality, when the personality of the other characters feel a lot more muted to me, but the characters are generally pretty good. Also, quickly, thank you for the ability to randomize character. Any game with multiple characters should have a random option, and I'm very thankful. Thought number 5, Act 3. I think in both Slay the Spire 1 and 2, Act 3 is typically the most boring part of the run for me. Part of that is, I think ultimately, Act 3 always seems to skirt under the challenge to power ratio in comparison to the other 2 acts. Maybe I play some weirdly hyper-greedy playstyle, but I rarely worry about Act 3 as much as I worry about Act 1 and 2, and I mentioned my loss rate on Act 3 in Slay the Spire 1 was much less than the other acts. This is something I initially thought might change in Slay the Spire 2, thinking that maybe there might be harder bosses, harder elites and so forth, but I don't truly feel like that's the case. I haven't found the bosses in Slay the Spire 2 to be particularly harder than the first games, and in general I think I found the overall design of the Act 3 bosses in the first game to be a little more alluring to me. I'm hoping, since these are early thoughts, as I actually get to the final ascensions, that changes, and maybe it'll feel worse, but ultimately I wish there was a little more push against me in Act 3, by the regular enemies and elites especially. The shortening of the map in Act 3 is almost a boon here, because I feel like I get to spend less time in the third of the game that's least engaging to me, but also, a lot of the time, I feel like I may as well play sloppy as I go through Act 3, because I feel like I've generally won the run as I'm choosing my Ancient Relic. Act 3's events have felt really good though. Not because they're necessarily positive, in fact I'm mostly thinking about the negative ones, but I love getting negative events. They feel like I'm really thinking about what's truly important during my build in them every time. But the fights have generally felt boring. I like the idea behind some of the enemies, but not enough to prefer them to Slay the Spire ones, when I think I prefer the Slay the Spire 2 enemies to the other floors. To summarize this quickly, Act 3 has always felt the least interesting to me, and while Slay the Spire 2 has felt just as good or sometimes better in Acts 1 and 2, it's Act 3 I find to be slightly worse than Act 3 in Slay the Spire, sans the events. And when I'm saying worse here, I mean that it's not hard enough, and more crucially doesn't feel engaging enough, particularly in the elites and regular enemies, and to a lesser extent the bosses too. Thought number 6, multiplayer. Multiplayer in Slay the Spire 2 has been okay. I played a fair chunk of the old and popular multiplayer Slay the Spire 1 mod, and I definitely prefer the structure of this version. Encountering the same encounters at the same time, ending turns at the same time at the cost of massively increased health is a decently satisfying experience. The addition of multiplayer-specific cards is also really engaging and allow for a lot of communication and interesting play. These are great. I have 2 main suggestions for multiplayer. The first is that I really wish there were either specific enemies for multiplayer or specific attacks. Doesn't really bother me which way or the other, whether it's some new mob or if, say, some enemies have like a slightly altered moveset for multiplayer. I think ultimately the universality of the enemies attacking everyone at once is a bit disappointing when there are so many interesting consequences that can occur when an enemy does damage to only one player, or maybe debuffs one player and buffs another at the same time perhaps. You'd have to be pretty clever in what the design would be for these though. Like, I can also very easily imagine an alternate world where they do this for multiplayer, and I'm making this video saying these alternate attacks end up feeling unfulfilling because one player feels targeted by the negative effect, and it makes poor draws by the other players feel worse when they can't capitalize on their friend being stunned or whatever. If they've experimented with this in dev and ultimately decided they don't want to pursue it, that's fine, but from my perspective, coming to the game only playing in this early access, this seems like a decent idea. The other thing I'd want is slightly better communication tools. The things we have right now for understanding what the other player is going through is pretty good right now, don't get me wrong. I love being able to click on the name of my ally gamers and seeing their deck and relics, and the hover to see what they're eyeing is nearly perfect. And the little icons when someone picks up a potion and a new card and stuff are perfectly visible without being distracting. Really good, enjoyable, easy to see mechanics. It feels great. Plus, if you're in a voice chat with your ally gamers, you can easily ask questions like, do you have vulnerable? Or say things like, hey, I have rally, don't worry about defense this turn. All of this, wonderful. I do wish, however, there was a way to ping cards in hand and put them in a little sidebar or element somewhere on the screen, even if just temporarily. I'd love to be able to ping, hey, I have vulnerable in Bash, with the implication being, it costs a lot of mana, but if you think this sort of effect would help us kill the enemy gamer, I'll do it. Or ping something like the silence skill that lets allies deal double, or any of these effects that you clearly want to stack in a certain order but aren't automatic plays because of mana or the uncertainty if your allies even have hits. My ideal version of this would also add a small reply system. I'm imagining a scenario like this. My friend has a bash, but really doesn't want to spend the mana on it. To let me know they have bash by, I don't know, right-clicking on it or something, and then a lightly transparent bash appears in the top right of the screen, or somewhere else. I can see that, consider whether bash would be worthwhile, then move my cursor over to the bash. Doing so would make it slightly less transparent, and 2 salient options would appear. Something green and yesy, and something red and no-y. And I can click on it to give that information to my friend. Like, yes, I'd like you to play this, or no, don't bother, let's defend up. A quick selection for text could also help, with phrases like "can we kill" or "I only have defense." Could be fine, but I think I'd prefer the system a bit. There's a couple reasons I think a system like this could be desirable. One is for when you're playing with someone with no voice accessibility for whatever reason, it would make communication a bit faster. And two, for the kind of player I am, where I do want to be making the best decisions each turn, but also yet with my friends, being able to offload a lot of the communication, like I found myself consistently repeating, "Do you're vulnerable? Do you're vulnerable? Do you're vulnerable?" Or "I can reduce strength, I can shield you, I can give you a card," or all of this stuff would be so much easier to do visually, still allowing for that interaction, but not taking up the communication space so much unless you really need to lock in for a specific turn. The version I've suggested does add a little bit of visual noise to something that can absolutely be seen as too visually noisy already with all the UI and visual elements multiplayer adds, but I think something along these lines would be pretty nice. Conclusion. Slay the Spire 2 has been an absolutely tantalizing experience. I've been really enjoying it. Visually, it's great, the run structure changes are amazing, the new characters are fine, multiplayer is pretty fun, but I do wish it was slightly different, at least for the kind of way that I want to interface with it, and I'm really curious to see how things develop in it. The new enemies are, generally speaking, a massive highlight as well. I didn't touch on strategies or theories I've built up yet because I don't think I've played enough or gotten far enough to say anything particularly unique. I'm mostly operating with my Slay the Spire 1 logic and some general rogue building deck-like logic without anything particular for Slay the Spire 2, other than starting to learn what all the elites and bosses try to test, although I think what they test is a little bit more opaque than in Slay 1, I feel. When I have learnt these things, I might make another video, but ultimately, I recommend watching Jorbs if you don't already. We have a lot of the same backing theory about how the game works at a fundamental level and how strategy games work at a fundamental level. He just has a lot of that theory out in videos, while mine is still in my head. And finally, thanks so much for the support and especially comments on the previous video. Seriously, the numbers on that thing have blown me away. The idea that over 10,000 people have watched me say some silly opinions on a video game is kinda crazy. There are some other stats that are truly mind-boggling, but I am really appreciative. Alright, see you later, alligators.